The lace on the borrowed dress was cheap and itched against her skin. It was the kind of cold that seeped through stone, the damp chill of old churches and older regrets. Chloe stood at the altar, her hands trembling not from love, but from a terrifying, hollow finality. 18 years old, an orphan with no one and nowhere to go. And now this. Mr. Henderson, the man who ran the group home she'd just aged out of, stood beside her, his hand a heavy, proprietary weight on her elbow. He had called it an arrangement, a solution to her problems. He'd found her a husband, a Japanese man who needed a wife to satisfy some visa requirement. A poor man, he'd said. A widower with a child. A simple, quiet life in exchange for a signature on a piece of paper. The lie was as thin as the watery morning light filtering through the grimy, stained glass. Chloe knew desperation when she saw it, and Mr. Henderson's was slick with sweat. He owed someone. He was selling her to settle a debt. Then the church doors opened, and he walked in. He wasn't what she'd expected. The word poor conjured images of threadbare clothes and a beaten-down posture. His suit was simple, a dark gray wool that had seen better days, but it hung on a frame that was anything but beaten. He moved with an unnerving stillness, a predatory grace that made the air in the room thicken. He wasn't tall, but he owned the space he occupied, his shoulders broad, his presence absolute. He stopped beside her at the altar, and she made the mistake of looking at him. His face was carved from hard angles and shadows, his jaw tight. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, flat, and ancient, holding a depth of cold calculation she had never seen in another human being. He didn't look at her like a bride. He looked at her like a problem he was efficiently solving. She looked down at his hands. They were clean, the nails impeccably cared for, but a fine white scar sliced across the knuckles of his right hand, a stark line against his skin. These were not the hands of a poor man struggling to get by. They were the hands of a man who knew how to break things. The priest, a nervous man with a perpetually damp forehead, began to rush through the ceremony. The words were a meaningless drone. Chloe felt a disconnect, a floating sensation, as if she were watching a film of someone else's life. Her entire world had narrowed to the scratch of the lace, the cold floor beneath her thin shoes, and the unnerving stillness of the man beside her. Do you, Chloe, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Mr. Henderson's fingers dug into her arm, a painful reminder of her lack of choice. She looked at the stranger. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold indifference. This was a transaction. Nothing more. Her survival depended on her compliance. I do, she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. When the priest asked him, the man's voice was low and resonant, a quiet rumble that seemed to vibrate through the stone floor. I do. It was not a vow. It was a statement of fact. A claim. There was no ring. The priest awkwardly pronounced them husband and wife. The man, her husband, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Mr. Henderson, who scurried away like a rat leaving a sinking ship. And then she was alone with him. The silence was heavier than any sound. He simply stood there, watching her, his dark eyes assessing her. She forced herself to meet his gaze, lifting her chin. She was terrified, but she would not show him. She had learned long ago that showing fear was an invitation for cruelty. My name is Takahiro, he said, his English perfect, without any discernible accent. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly. Chloe. He nodded once.
Come.
He led her out of the church not by the hand, but by walking just ahead of her, an unspoken command for her to follow. A plain black car was waiting at the curb, the kind of older model that blended into any street. A man in a simple driver's uniform held the door open. He bowed his head low to Takahiro, a gesture of deep, almost fearful respect that seemed utterly at odds with the worn-out car and Takahiro's simple suit. The drive was silent. They moved through the bustling streets of Tokyo, then into the quieter, winding roads that led into the hills overlooking the city. She'd expected a small apartment in a crowded district, the kind of place a poor single dad would live. But they kept driving, climbing higher, leaving the city behind. The car turned onto a private, unmarked road, the asphalt smooth and dark. High stone walls, topped with discreet security cameras, rose on either side, completely obscuring whatever lay beyond. They stopped before a massive, imposing gate made of dark, aged wood and black iron. It swung open silently, without a guard in sight. That was when the floor of Chloe's world didn't just drop, it vanished completely. It was not a house. It was a compound. A sprawling, traditional Japanese estate lay nestled in a meticulously sculpted landscape of ancient pines, moss-covered rocks, and a serene koi pond the size of a swimming pool. The main house was a masterpiece of dark wood, rice paper screens, and elegant, sweeping rooflines. It was a fortress of quiet, understated wealth, a place of immense and hidden power. The car stopped. The driver opened her door. Takahiro was already out, standing before the entrance to the house, his back to her. He hadn't looked back once to see if she was following. He didn't need to. He knew she had nowhere else to go. She got out of the car, the cheap lace of her wedding dress feeling like a costume in this world of silent, disciplined luxury. This was not the home of a poor man. This was the home of a king. A cold, terrifying realization washed over her. She hadn't been married off to a simple man. She had been sold to a very, very dangerous one. An older woman in a simple, elegant kimono slid open the main door and bowed deeply. Takahiro stepped inside, and after a moment's hesitation, Chloe followed him into the shadows of her new life. The interior of the house was a paradox of minimalist beauty and oppressive silence. The air smelled of cedar, old wood, and the faint, clean scent of rain. Every surface was immaculate, every object placed with deliberate, artistic precision. Men in dark, perfectly tailored suits stood in the shadows of the hallways, their presence a silent, watchful perimeter. They moved with the same lethal stillness as their master, their gazes sliding over Chloe before dismissing her. Takahiro led her through a labyrinth of corridors to a room overlooking a private garden. A single, low table sat in the center of the tatami mat floor. "You will stay here," he stated, not asked. "You will not leave the grounds. You will be provided with whatever you need." "What is this place?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Who are you?" He turned to face her, his dark eyes holding no warmth, no reassurance. "I am the man you married. That is all you need to know." Before she could press further, a small figure appeared in the doorway. A little girl, no older than 7, with Takahiro's dark, serious eyes and a cascade of silky black hair. She clutched a worn teddy bear and looked at Chloe with a solemn curiosity. "This is Hannah," Takahiro said, his voice softening by a fraction of a degree, the first hint of any emotion she had detected in him. "My daughter." Hannah stared at Chloe, her gaze unwavering. Chloe offered a small, tentative smile. The little girl did not smile back. She simply watched, a silent observer in her father's silent kingdom. That was the moment Chloe understood the true nature of her prison. It wasn't just the stone walls or the silent guards. It was him, and it was his daughter. She was a piece in a game she didn't understand, a stranger brought into the heart of a silent, dangerous empire. The days that followed blurred into a routine of quiet observation. Chloe was a ghost in the house, confined to her rooms and the small, walled garden they overlooked. The housekeeper, an older woman named Mrs. Sato, brought her meals and fresh clothes, simple, elegant silks and cottons that felt alien against her skin. She spoke little English, and their interactions were limited to polite nods and gestures. Chloe's only real human contact was with Hannah. The little girl would appear at her door each afternoon, holding a picture book, and simply sit. She never spoke at first. She would just turn the pages, her small finger tracing the illustrations. Chloe, remembering her own lonely childhood spent in the quiet corners of libraries, understood. She didn't push. She just sat with her, sharing the silence. One afternoon, Chloe began to read the story aloud in a soft voice. Hannah didn't look up, but she stopped turning the pages, listening. From that day on, it became their ritual. Chloe would read, and Hannah would listen, her small body leaning ever so slightly closer each day. She saw Takahiro only in glimpses. He would appear at dusk, a shadow moving through his own home, always surrounded by his silent, suited men. He never spoke to Chloe, but she would often feel his eyes on her. Once, she looked up from reading to Hannah in the garden and saw him standing on a veranda above, watching them. His face was unreadable, but for a fleeting second, she saw something in his eyes, not warmth, but a flicker of something less cold. An assessment. She learned about him not through words, but through the atmosphere of the house. The way his soldiers straightened when he entered a room. The way absolute silence fell when he spoke in low, clipped Japanese to his lieutenants. Power radiated from him, a palpable force field of control and authority. He was the center of this universe, and everything revolved around his will. One evening, while Hannah was asleep, Chloe found a small, lacquered box left on her table. Inside was a photograph. It was of a beautiful woman with a vibrant, joyful smile, her arm linked with a younger Takahiro. He was smiling too, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed his harsh features. It was a shocking sight. On the back, an inscription in English, "My Yoshiko. Forever." Mrs. Sato entered the room silently. She saw the photo in Chloe's hands, and her usual stoic expression softened with a deep sadness. "Hannah's mother," she said in careful, practiced English. "She was a light. Taken. A long time ago." The word, taken, hung in the air, heavy and violent. It wasn't a sickness, not an accident. It was an act. Chloe looked at the photo again, at the man who knew how to smile, and then thought of the cold, silent man he had become. That was his wound. The ghost he lived with. The reason for the fortress, for the guards, for the daughter he watched with such fierce, silent protectiveness. The first crack in the silent peace of the estate came a week later. It was late afternoon. Chloe was in the garden with Hannah, teaching her a simple clapping game. The sound of Hannah's rare, quiet giggle was a small, bright jewel in the silence. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed from the outer wall, followed by another. It wasn't a firecracker. It was gunfire. Instinct, honed by a life of being aware of her surroundings, took over. Chloe didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She scooped Hannah into her arms, her mind racing. "Inside now," she whispered, her voice low and calm. She pulled Hannah into her rooms, sliding the heavy shoji screen shut just as men in the garden began to shout in Japanese. She could hear the thud of running feet, the sharp, controlled commands. She pushed Hannah behind a heavy wooden chest in the corner of the room, shielding the little girl with her own body. Hannah was trembling, her face buried in Chloe's side, but she was silent, a discipline that must have been drilled into her from birth. The sounds of the fight were brief and brutal. A few more shots, a sickening thud, and then an unnerving silence. Chloe held her breath, every muscle tensed. She could run. The garden had a small service gate, she'd noticed. In the chaos, she could slip away, disappear, be free. She looked down at the small, dark head pressed against her. Hannah was so small, so fragile. Leaving her felt like a betrayal she couldn't stomach. It wasn't a choice, not really. She couldn't leave this child. So she stayed, her arms wrapped tightly around the little girl, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. Minutes later, the screen slid open. It was Takahiro. He was flanked by two of his men, his face a mask of cold fury. His eyes, however, were fixed on Hannah. He scanned the room, his gaze sharp and analytical, checking for threats. When he saw them huddled in the corner, safe, a flicker of something, relief, crossed his face before it was gone. He knelt, speaking to Hannah in soft, reassuring Japanese. The little girl finally let out a choked sob and threw her arms around his neck. He held her, his large hand stroking her hair. Over his daughter's shoulder, his eyes met Chloe's. The coldness was still there, but it was layered with something else now. Something she couldn't name. He spoke to one of his men, who bowed and left. Takahiro gently disentangled himself from Hana and walked over to Chloe. He stood over her, a towering, intimidating presence. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low growl.
No.
His gaze swept over her, and then he noticed the long, angry scratch on her forearm where she had scraped it against the wooden chest. Before she could react, he reached out, his fingers gently taking her arm. His touch was surprisingly warm, his calloused thumb brushing against her skin. It was the first time he had touched her since their cold, impersonal wedding. The contact was electric. A jolt of awareness shot through her. She looked up, and his dark eyes were locked on hers. The silence stretched, thick and charged. For a long, breathless moment, the world narrowed to the space between them, the feeling of his hand on her skin, the intensity of his gaze. He wasn't looking at a transaction anymore. He was looking at her. He dropped her arm as if it had burned him and stood up abruptly, turning away. "You did well," he said, his back to her. "You kept her safe." It wasn't praise.
It was a simple statement of fact.
But coming from him, it felt like more. It felt like an acknowledgement. A shift in the foundation of their strange, silent arrangement. The threat outside was real, but for the first time, Chloe felt the faint, terrifying stirrings of a different kind of danger, one that came from the man standing right in front of her. The attack changed everything. The silent, watchful peace of the estate was replaced by a tense, coiled energy. The number of guards doubled. Takahiro was a constant, restless presence, a predator pacing the confines of his cage. He had meetings at all hours, his lieutenants coming and going, their faces grim. The name Ozaki was one she heard spoken often, always in tones of cold fury. Chloe knew she was a prisoner, but now she felt like a target. The men who had attacked the compound weren't trying to get to him. They were testing his defenses. And she, the new, unknown foreign wife, was the most obvious weakness. One afternoon, Takahiro summoned her to his study. It was a room she had never been in before, a space of dark wood, leather, and the faint scent of smoke and something else, bergamot. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes in Japanese and English, on everything from military history to classical poetry. A single, perfect katana rested on a stand behind his desk. He was standing by the window, looking out at the city below. The men who attacked, they are from a rival clan, led by a man named Ozaki. He believes what is mine should be his. He turned to face her. He sees you as a vulnerability, a tool to be used against me. "What do you want me to do?" Chloe asked, her voice even. "I want you to stay inside. You will not leave Hannah's side. You are safest here." "I'm not safe anywhere with you," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. His eyes narrowed. A dangerous glint entered them. "You made a choice to stay when you could have run. During the attack, you chose to protect my daughter over your own freedom. That choice has consequences." He was right. She had tied her fate to theirs in that moment. "She's a child," Chloe said softly. She was scared. "Many people are scared," he replied, his voice dropping to a low, intense timbre. "Few have the courage to act. You do." He took a step closer, closing the space between them. "You should have run, Chloe. Now they see you as mine. And I do not give up what is mine." His use of her name, the possessive, dangerous tone in his voice, sent a shiver down her spine. It was not a declaration of affection. It was a statement of ownership, a brand. The threat escalated a few days later. Against his orders, Chloe had coaxed Hannah into the garden for some fresh air. The tension in the house was suffocating the little girl. They were near the koi pond when it happened. Two men, dressed as gardeners, appeared from behind a manicured hedge. They weren't his. She knew instantly. Their movements were wrong, too quick, too aggressive. One lunged for Hannah. Chloe reacted without thinking, shoving Hannah behind her and grabbing a heavy ceramic pot, swinging it with all her might into the man's side. He grunted in pain, stumbling back. But the second man grabbed Chloe from behind, his arm locking around her throat, cutting off her air. She struggled, kicking, clawing at his arm. Her vision started to tunnel. She heard Hannah scream, a high, terrified sound. Then, a blur of motion. Takahiro was there, moving with a speed and violence that was terrifying to behold. It wasn't a fight, it was a surgical execution. He disarmed the first man with a brutal efficiency, a series of precise, disabling strikes. The man holding her tightened his grip, pulling a knife and pressing it to her throat. "Call him off," he snarled. Takahiro went absolutely still. His eyes, fixed on the knife at Chloe's throat, became black pits of lethal rage. "Let her go," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "Or you'll what? I'll kill her before your men can even move." Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the cold steel against her skin. This was it. This was how it ended. But then she saw it. The slight shift in Takahiro's weight, the subtle tensing of his shoulders. He was going to move. He was willing to risk her life to end the threat. In that split second, she acted. She drove her heel down, hard, onto the man's instep. He roared in pain, his grip faltering for a fraction of a second. It was all Takahiro needed. He moved, a black shadow of impossible speed. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the man holding her collapsed. Takahiro didn't spare him a glance. His focus was entirely on her. He rushed to her side, his hands hovering over her, checking for injuries. His face was a storm of emotions she couldn't decipher: fury, fear, and a raw, terrifying possessiveness. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice ragged. A thin line of blood trickled from a shallow cut on her neck. He saw it, and a muscle in his jaw clenched so tightly she thought it might break. He gently touched the side of her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness it stole her breath. "I told myself keeping you was a matter of honor," he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear it. "A debt to be paid. I was lying to myself." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. It wasn't a confession of love. It was something deeper, more dangerous. An admission that she had breached his walls, that she had become more than just a part of an arrangement. She had become a part of him. The failed kidnapping attempt forced them from the estate. It was no longer secure. That night, under the cover of darkness, they fled to a modern, anonymous penthouse apartment overlooking the glittering expanse of Shinjuku. It was a safe house, a sterile cage of glass and steel. During the escape, there had been another ambush. A chaotic, violent firefight in a darkened alley. Takahiro had thrown himself in front of her and Hannah, shielding them with his body. He'd moved through the violence like it was his native language, but he hadn't been fast enough. A bullet had grazed his side, tearing through his suit jacket and shirt. He'd hidden it until they were safely inside the penthouse. He collapsed against a wall, his hand pressed to his side, his face pale. Blood was already soaking through the fine white cotton of his shirt. "Get Hannah to her room," he ordered one of his men. To another, he said, "Secure the perimeter. No one gets in or out." His men moved to obey, but Chloe didn't leave. She knelt beside him. "You need a doctor." "No doctors," he gritted out. "Ozaki will be watching the hospitals." She looked at the wound. It was bleeding badly, but the bullet seemed to have passed through. It was messy, but she could handle it. In the group home, she'd learned to patch up everything from scraped knees to fight wounds. "I can do it," she said, her voice firm. She was no longer the scared girl from the church. That girl was gone, burned away in the fire of the last few weeks. "Tell me where the medical supplies are." He stared at her for a long moment, his breath coming in shallow pants. He saw the determination in her eyes, the steady competence in her hands. He gave a curt nod. She worked with a focused intensity, cleaning the wound, her hands moving deftly. This was something she could control, a problem she could solve. Her hands were soon covered in his blood. She was no longer an outsider. She was complicit, her hands literally stained by his world. She was crossing a line she could never uncross. He was silent as she worked, his eyes never leaving her face. The pain must have been immense, but he didn't make a sound. The air in the room was thick with the coppery smell of his blood and the charged silence between them. As she tied off the bandage, her fingers brushed against the warm skin of his abdomen. He flinched, not from pain, but from the contact. "You are not what I expected," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Neither are you," she replied, meeting his gaze. He reached up, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. His eyes were dark, intense, filled with a raw emotion that made her heart ache. "This life, it will destroy you. It's a bit late for that, don't you think?" she said, a sad smile touching her lips. "I should have let you go," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "The first day, but you didn't." "No," he said, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I didn't." He leaned in, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. But he stopped, his forehead resting against hers. She could feel his breath on her skin, warm and unsteady. It was a moment of pure, unguarded vulnerability, a surrender. He was the most powerful man in the Tokyo underworld, a king in his empire, and in that moment, he was just a man, wounded and bleeding in a safe house with the woman he had tied to his dangerous fate. The war was no longer just with Ozaki. It was with the undeniable, terrifying truth that had grown between them in the crucible of violence and fear. The final confrontation came 2 nights later. Ozaki, enraged and desperate, had somehow found them. The assault on the penthouse was not a test. It was an extermination. The alarms blared, the sound of automatic gunfire shattering the floor-to-ceiling windows. Takahiro's men formed a defensive ring, a brutal, close-quarters battle erupting in the living area. Takahiro, his side bandaged but his movements still lethally precise, was a whirlwind of controlled violence. He pressed a small, cold pistol into Chloe's hand. "Stay with Hannah," he commanded, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "Do not open the door for anyone but me. Do you understand?" She nodded, her hand trembling as she gripped the unfamiliar weight of the gun. She pulled Hannah into the master bedroom, barricading the door with a heavy dresser. The sounds from outside were terrifying: gunshots, shattering glass, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor. Hannah was crying silently, her face buried in Chloe's lap. Chloe held her tight, whispering reassurances she didn't feel, her own heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. After an eternity, the sounds of fighting died down, replaced by an even more terrifying silence. Then, a soft knock on the door. "Chloe? It's over. Open the door." It was Takahiro's voice. But something was wrong. It was too calm, too steady. Through the chaos, she had learned the cadence of his voice under pressure. This wasn't it. "What was my wife's name?" Chloe called out, her voice shaking. "Hannah's mother." Silence. Then, a furious banging on the door. "Open this door now." It wasn't him. Chloe's blood ran cold. She backed away, pulling Hannah with her, the gun raised in her trembling hands. The door splintered, then burst open. A man stood there, not Takahiro, but a stranger with cruel eyes and a triumphant sneer. Ozaki. Behind him, 2 of his men dragged a wounded, struggling Takahiro, a gun pressed to his head. "Clever girl," Ozaki said, his eyes raking over her. "He chose well. A pity it has to end this way," he gestured to Takahiro. "He is a man who values tradition.
Honor.
So, I will give him an honorable choice. Your life, or his daughter's." Takahiro's eyes, filled with a helpless rage, met Chloe's. He would never choose. He would die before sacrificing either of them. And Ozaki knew it. This was not a choice. It was torture. Chloe looked at the gun in her hand. She was not a killer. She was a librarian, a girl who had survived by being quiet and invisible. But that girl was gone. She looked at Hannah, small and terrified. She looked at Takahiro, the cold, dangerous man who had shown her a sliver of the man he used to be. The man who had confessed he was lying to himself about what she meant to him. She would not be a passive victim in the final act of her life. "All right," Chloe said, her voice surprisingly steady. She lowered the gun, placing it on the floor and kicking it away. Let them go. It's me you want. I'm his weakness, right? Take me. Ozaki laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. A noble sacrifice, he signaled to his man. Kill the girl first. As the man holding Hana raised his weapon, Chloe acted. She wasn't aiming for Ozaki. She was aiming for the fire alarm sprinkler head on the ceiling, just above a bank of electronic equipment by the door. She'd noticed it when they first arrived. She grabbed a heavy glass lamp from the bedside table and hurled it with every ounce of strength she had. It struck true. The sprinkler head shattered, and ice-cold water began to spray down, dousing the electronic panel. Sparks flew. The lights in the room flickered and died, plunging them into a disorienting darkness, lit only by the emergency lights from the hallway. In the chaos, Takahiro moved. Freed from the direct threat to his daughter, he exploded into action. He slammed his head back into the man holding him, dropping the other with a brutal elbow strike. The room erupted into a flurry of motion and sound in the near darkness. Chloe scrambled for Hana, pulling her under the bed. A shot went wild, embedding itself in the wall where they had just been standing. She covered Hana's ears, shielding her from the brutal sounds of the fight to the death happening just feet away. It was over in seconds. A final, sickening thud, and then silence. A moment later, the emergency lights in the room flickered on. Ozaki lay dead on the floor. Takahiro stood over him, his chest heaving, his face a grim mask of blood and fury. One of his most trusted men, the quiet driver who had picked Chloe up from the church, lay motionless by the door. A cost had been paid. Takahiro came to her then, kneeling down and pulling her and Hana out from under the bed. He crushed them both in a fierce embrace, his body trembling with the aftermath of the fight. He held them for a long time, saying nothing. No words were needed. They returned to the estate. It was clean, silent, secure. The threat of Ozaki was gone. His clan would be absorbed, his territory claimed. The war was over. That evening, Chloe stood on the veranda, looking out at the perfectly manicured garden, now bathed in the soft light of dusk. She felt a quiet sense of belonging that terrified and soothed her in equal measure. This violent, beautiful world was her home now. She had chosen it. Takahiro came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat of his presence. He is dead, he said.
It was a simple fact.
His organization is mine. It is finished. And us? She asked, not looking at him. What is finished? He was silent for a long moment. Then, he gently took her hand. His fingers, scarred and strong, laced through hers. Nothing is finished, he said, his voice low and certain. You are the mistress of this house. You are Hana's mother. You are my wife. In every way that matters. No one will ever touch you again. That is my vow. It wasn't a declaration of love, not in the way the stories she used to read described it. It was something more profound. An oath, sealed in blood and violence. A claim on her soul, made not at a cold altar, but in the heart of a storm she had helped him weather. She finally turned to look at him. The cold mask was gone. In his dark eyes, she saw the man from the photograph, the man who knew how to smile. He wasn't smiling now, but the possibility was there, a distant shore she knew they could one day reach. She squeezed his hand, a silent acceptance. In the garden below, Hana was chasing fireflies, her laughter a bright, clear sound in the twilight. Chloe watched her, a small, resilient flower thriving in the shadow of an empire. Her gaze met Takahiro's over the child's head. No more words were needed. This was their life now, a dangerous, complicated, and undeniable truth. And for the first time, it felt like enough.